Dad, I want to say thank you for even sitting down and doing this. I know that you've got many, many things that you want to share about your journey. I think the best way of starting that is to recap your professional experience before we go to your personal, diagnosis and then some of the medical hypotheses that you're going to be talking about today. So why don't we just open up with, who you are, where you trained, what you did in your practices, and then we'll kind of move forward from there.
Okay. Well, I was lucky enough to have two really good biology teachers and a wonderful grandmother, and all three of them inspired me to basically be a biologist, although I knew I wanted to be a vet when I was 7 years old. I then went to school, as I say, underneath these wonderful masters. One taught botany, the other taught zoology, but between them we had a fantastic grounding in general biology. I then went on to the Royal Vet School, Royal Vet College in London, where again we had a really good education, but just over 6 years long. And from there I did an internship as a student with a wonderful chap called Dr. Janssen, who ultimately started this enormous drug company. I think he sold out, I'm not quite sure to which American multinational, but I think it was Smith and Nephew, I'm not sure. Sorry, Johnson & Johnson, I'm not sure about that. He was responsible for the fentanyl molecule as well. His primary interest was opioids, but he was interested also in flu vaccines. The Royal Vet College had made a flu vaccine at this time for the pig, and as students, he used to have 2 or 3 of us over there as lab rats. He started in the garage of his father's house, and we used to just be muddling around in his garage, exchanging ideas, and I think in the nicest way he was basically trying to get what the Royal College had to offer. I think the Royal College was fully aware that their technology was being used to develop a human flu vaccine. From then on, I went to, in practice with another wonderful set of bosses in Ashford in Kent, and on after that to an internship at Ames, Iowa, in the equine department. From there, I came home because my father was dying, and I didn't want him to know why I was coming home early, but I came home early from my internship. I went into practice and ultimately put my plate up in a market town called Corsham in Wiltshire. And we just built that up into several small animal branches and an equine department, and thoroughly enjoyed ourselves. We always had one foot in clinical medicine, in clinical research, in as much that we would quite often get products which were just about to go to market to test in real practice. Unfortunately, from then on, I was divorced and had to look for a new career. I couldn't be asked to start again all over again, putting up my plate. I just took the winds out of my sail. So I changed direction with great difficulty because I hadn't got a PhD. And I eventually ended up teaching at a couple of mediocre universities, but fortunately was asked by Imperial College to go to their Y campus and run animal science courses, equine science courses, and to do home office work, developing several novel treatments, one of which was the proof of concept for nutritional control of diabetes, and we had diabetic pigs. The other was intravenous feeding of premature babies. That was a multinational project from the European, from Europe, involving the Spanish, the Italians, the Germans, the French, the English. I think that's all of us. Anyway, it was a wonderful cooperative project. I did all the surgery for that particular project.
Going all the way back to losing your father, firstly, what did Gapper Geering die from? What type of cancer?
He died from pulmonary lung cancer. He smoked 60 cigarettes a day, basically because after the war he had he was at Dunkirk, but after Dunkirk, apart from supplying the front, he was not in any real bloody war. He was not fighting. He was supplying the front, but not fighting, and losing men and injuries in the same way as the other frontline soldiers were. As a result, I think those soldiers were demobbed much, much later. Those who had been in Africa and Italy and Germany on the front lines, I think, were demobbed in 1945 or soon after. But Dad was sent to, with a lot of colleagues, sent to the Low Countries, Belgium and Holland, to await resettlement of all the refugees. And for this, they had to wait for martial aid to arrive, which took several years to arrive and to get organized. And so they sat around drinking too much and smoking too much in the naffy, cheap booze and cheap cigarettes. And that was his undoing.
When you lost Gapper Geering to cancer, did that add fuel to your fire when it came to not only the veterinary side, the medical side for the animal species, but also starting to contemplate some of these off-label applications for the human side?
No, your grandfather, in fact, did two things. He realized first of all, he wouldn't admit that smoking caused cancer. The evidence was just coming in, was just building. And he said, "Oh, you medics, you blame this, you blame that. You don't really know what's causing it." So we were fighting a bit of an uphill battle. But he did bribe all three of us. He bribed all three of us not to smoke till we were 21. He said, "I'll give you, each of you, 100 quid if you don't smoke till you're 21. And none of us did. And 100 quid was a lot of money in those days. And so not really. I didn't. I was always really curious about everything to do with biology, not just medicine. But no, I can't really say. I certainly didn't think about alternative use of drugs. No.
What is your opinion now as we sit here in 2026 and it is undeniable, not only the fact that tobacco gives us cancer, but knowing that these tobacco companies are putting in additives to create further addiction and, try and get people to keep smoking. But we still have, I would argue, a new young population that are smoking more. And I feel like the vapes have maybe, contributed to that. If you were king for a day, knowing that prohibition on its own doesn't work very well, what would you do to try and further eliminate the use of cigarettes completely?
Well, I think really just education. There are so many exciting things, and I have to be very careful what I say here because I've been out of teaching. Incidentally, I forgot to add I was teaching at Imperial for 10 years during that time, both veterinary students, animal science students, and medical students. I was teaching them preclinical studies, but I think I'd try and use education. I think I'd try and get to children. I'd try and use cartoons, and I've been retired from. I think I retired in 2005 or something like that, very much later than I should have done. But the changes because of the technology, the changes in the understanding of genetics, DNA, RNA, and the interaction with genes and the interaction with foods, I think I'd try and major on that because in the last few days, that suddenly dawned on me that, of course, in all probability, it's the cigarettes reacting with a given set of genes that will have either cause or exacerbate the cancers, because not everyone gets it, even if they smoke a phenomenal number of cigarettes. And I think the most exciting area of science now that for me, that I'd be doing if I was able to, is looking at the aspect of genomics, where it interacts, your own genes interact with the environment. And I say I have to have a bit of a caveat here because it's such a new science and I am not party to it and don't fully understand it. And I think indeed those researchers are feeling their way ahead anyway. But it seems that the way genes are switched on and switched off are so intricate, tied up with everything from environment, lifestyle, and nutrition. And it's so exciting, really, that you can, if you know enough about this, which they're beginning to, you can dampen down or switch off adverse set of genes or encourage a set of genes which are going to protect you. Of course, we've been doing all this all our lives, and although it seems very difficult to cure cancers by nutrition alone, and again, there are one or two ideas out there, the keto, for example, and really concentrating on nutrition, where people claim that you can make complete reverses in cancers. That the main emphasis must be, for which there is a lot of evidence, that you can minimize the chance of you getting cancer by eating all the correct nutrients. And part of the stuff I've done in my journey through this wretched disease, which, by the way, is a cancer of the duodenum, adenocarcinoma of the duodenum, a part of my idea was to look at nutrients and to look at the pathways of adenocarcinoma and match the nutrients in such a way that I attempt to treat my cancer. Now, that is not going to get anywhere, I don't think. But what does get everywhere is if people have those nutrients as part of their normal diet, they are switching off cancers left, right, and center, about which they know nothing. You have these malignant cancer cells wandering around all the time in your body. Everybody does, however healthy, however they don't smoke or don't drink or whatever genes they're dealt. They've got them floating around their body, and the correct nutrients and the correct lifestyle, the correct energy levels of exercise and so on will mop up an awful lot of trouble, and you won't know what you've mopped up. You'll just know that you're living longer and better than you would have done otherwise. Incidentally, I meant to preface these remarks really with the fact that as I left teaching, I would still have said to you, you're dealt your genes, tough, just get on with it. Now that's going to be turned on its head, as indeed lots of stuff I used to teach in the advance of extra knowledge about the subject. The ideas have to be turned on the head. And I think the genes you've been dealt with, you can modify a lot by behaving appropriately.
Yeah, no, I agree completely. And it's funny, I was thinking about when COVID happened and all the vehicles were pulled off the road, and people weren't in buildings. So, a lot of the generators and all these other things weren't pushing out all the pollutants. And you have this conversation about, the ozone layer and global warming, and is it or isn't it? And let's be honest, unless you're in that research field, you really don't know. But you can tell if the air in Los Angeles around you is getting clearer. You can tell if the water in the Nile is getting clearer. So when you focus on the things that you can see, like you said, you can control whether you smoke or not. You can control whether you eat, a spectrum of color on your plate. Then you're, amplifying or reducing the chances of getting ill. Whether you can tell whether that cancer gene is going to be turned on and off is out of your control, but the lifestyle choices are in your control: exercise, meditation, sleep, etc. So when we get to combine that with maybe some, nutritional supplements that help bolster the genes and make it even less likely, then that's really exciting. But I think if we just focus on what we can control, whether it's seeing, the air get clearer in our city, or just eating and maintaining a healthy body weight, or not smoking, because even if you don't get cancer, you still get emphysema and COPD and all the other horrible things, then I think that's a powerful takeaway. I think the the combination of some truly exciting advances in medicine and the lifestyle elements that we know work because they've worked for millennia, if you combine both of those rather than argue one or the other is right, I think that's when people are on the best path.
Yes, in fact, when listening to you then, I thought, oh my God, I left out sleep. And my mentor, that dear man, Professor Russell Foster, who unfortunately was poached by Oxford from Imperial, he would be cross with me for not raising it. I mean, he for me was an amazing influence. When I went to Imperial, I was the only non-PhD in the common room. And he rang me up and said, would you like me to come and lecture my students? And I said, oh, I jumped at it. And because of his idea that light was measured in other places than the eye, and when because he'd been considered a maverick until this line of thinking was finally worked out by him in Imperial and in Oxford, and indeed in America, where one of his bosses believed in him passionately. Until that happened, I felt an outsider. Perhaps I wasn't an outsider. Anyway, he came and lectured us, and of course, to a vet, he was pushing against an open door because we've got many animals that measure light other than through the eye, particularly the blind mole, of course.
Well, speaking of that, Russell's been on twice now on my podcast, and one of the things I love about him is that he's a disruptor. You know, he did his research, he found a truth, and no matter how much resistance he experienced, especially in the world of ophthalmology, you know, he just stood his ground, you know, proved to them that this was a real thing. And now everyone's talking about, you know, when you first wake up, go outside, get the daylight on your eyes. It helps set your chronobiology. And so now, you know, people don't even know who the guy was that fought for that in the first place. As you progress through your veterinary career, when did you start seeing whether it was off-label uses for the drugs you were using or applications of veterinary medicine in the human world?
Well, it happened in a very small way, really. It happened in reverse because I would have a condition, I can't think of one offhand, but I would have a condition where there was a human drug, not licensed for veterinary use, but licensed for human drug, as a human drug, where I would be able to say to a client, look, I think this is not licensed for animals. I think it could well benefit your animal. These were mostly small animals. May have been one or two horse cases, I can't remember. Anyway, because it didn't happen very often, because in those days, the veterinary profession was well supplied with its own drugs. And you then say, well, I'd like to do this. I think we've got no alternative because otherwise we're going to be in big trouble. We may have to put your animal down or it may well die. I'm not insured if I do this, but as long as you don't sue me, then let's do it. And for the most part, every client did, and for the most part, it came off. But it was a fairly safe bet because we, of course, had done the original trials in mice and rabbits and God knows what. It just so happens that it wasn't licensed for animals, although it went on to be licensed in man, jumping species in that way. And so, in a way, that's, I suppose, when I first became aware. But I didn't become aware about the huge dynamic that should be involved, because if any of us are right, and we're quite prepared to be proven wrong, in fact, it's as valuable to prove us wrong as prove us right, then you're going to benefit health in general hugely financially, because particularly the cancer drugs are so expensive per course, and these repurposed drugs, because they're off license, are really very cheap. They're made very ethically still, but still very cheap.
This isn't a conspiracy theory at all. It's just simple economics. Talk to me about how much money is in the, what we're calling at the moment, the traditional treatment for cancer, the chemotherapies, the radiotherapies.
Well, I'm not the person to ask, but the little research I've done, I gather, and it varies obviously from drug to drug and how modern they are and all the rest of it. and the economy of scale, because the problem with my tumor is it's so rare, no one's bothered to make anything for it. I don't know how expensive immunotherapy is, and that must be the most exciting and, in the end, the most cost-effective way to go. But what I was faced with was chemo, and when I looked at the prices of chemo, not that I was interested in going on chemo as it happened, that sort of chemo, I gather one course, and you often need multiple courses, and one course is £3,000.
Now, I know in America, ours, you can add a zero, if not more, to each of those because of the way our, disease care model is. And as I know people that literally have spent more than they spent on their house simply on chemotherapy. So one has to wonder if some of the resistance from some of these off-label applications we're going to be talking about today is also coming from a financial point of view, because what we're trying to do, same with CBD, same with even the conversation on, exercise, nutrition, sleep, which was, almost vilified during COVID, for example, is you're also threatening a multi, I don't know if it's billion or trillion now, industry.
Yeah, I mean, I'm literally voicing aloud the thoughts I have in my head. I don't quite understand. As I understand it, it's a question of money. I don't quite understand why governments can't override it unless they've got vested interest, which there's one or two indications that they might well have. But if a drug is cheap because it's been off license for a long time, and the two I'm particularly interested in, one was off mebendazole or the thiazoles were created in the 1960s, and ivermectin was 1970s, I think. And they've been off license for a long time. What I don't get is both those drugs, I'm sure, could be the absorption from the gut could be improved, namely because they're designed as wormers in the first instance, and therefore they only need to sit about the gut to punish the worms, and then their job is done. If you're going to try and punish a cancer in a body, you've got to get, unless you can apply it through the skin, which you can in one or two melanomas, there is in fact, I think, some dressings which you can actually put active principles on the skin. Unless you can do that, you're going to have to get it absorbed. And to get it absorbed, you've got to get it across the gut. Now, particularly with AI, because in Dr. Janssen's day, he used to synthesize about 3,000 compounds before he took one to market. And now with AI, this is being short-circuited because we can tell what molecule is going to do something pretty nasty to you, and you can tell whether the molecule will help punish an individual cancer purely by using AI and mathematical modeling. And so the situation I don't understand is why, if you can tweak an existing molecule, let's say of mebendazole, you can tweak it in such a way that it's better absorbed, add some hydrophobic or lipophobic or something just to help it cross the gut wall. This is an area I'm just pontificating about, but I know it's done, obviously. Why can't you add something to this molecule and now patent it? Why isn't there some margin for profit there? That I don't understand, but that must be related to patent law, I think, and the basic molecule. Because I do know when Professor, I can't remember his name, the professor at Imperial who designed the basic herbicide molecule, I know that patents were drawn for molecules that were where his basic molecule was changed to do slightly different jobs. I don't see why the same couldn't happen in medicines.
When a lot of people hear the word ivermectin, unless they are in the veterinary world and they just think wormer, everyone else is thinking, alternative COVID treatment. And what's interesting is the way you're describing that medication. It makes sense to me that if it's designed to stay in the stomach to attack, the helminths in the gut itself, then if there isn't if it's not readily absorbed into the bloodstream, it then makes you question how effective was it, against the COVID virus or the immune response to the COVID virus.
Well, I have had two problems really as I've researched for my own purely personal selfish research as has been, is that evidence is building actually that COVID is quite useful in certain infections. But I've kept away from that because it's probably the most contentious bit, or currently was the most contentious bit of it. And I think part of the trouble that everyone's having is that the gainsayers are there in equal amount, if not more so, than people who are trying to talk around some reasonable science. And I think also even people like me have to be really, really careful. There's one man who is extremely vocal and I think probably right on the, going up the right track. But he has fringe ideas which are contentious, and he pushes those as well as his drug ideas. And I think that detracts from the gravitas of what he's saying. And I think quite a lot of people do that. Whether it's, I could be called a fanatic. I'm desperate that if there are some cheaper alternatives, they should be in action. And so I suppose to some extent I'm also a fanatic. But I think we do ourselves harm by either over-claiming or having fringe opinions, which are nothing to do with the argument in progress.
Yeah, I agree 100%. One more area, because I know it's still kind of related to what we're talking about at the moment. You and I have talked in the past about the efficacies of the vaccines that were out there for COVID. And you mentioned one technology that was actually proven to be more effective that wasn't taken up by, the world's vaccination program. So, what in your opinion was the best treatment out there, and what, if any, are there as far as dangers of some of these vaccines that people were ultimately told to take if you were wearing a uniform at any point?
Yeah, well, I'm not really going to go there at all because I don't know enough to talk around it properly. I just know from talking to various virologists and talking to a man who I think should be listened to by many, many more people, Professor Angus Dalgleish. And you want to listen to what he has to say. In fact, I think you could well interview him, and if you're interested in pursuing this particular aspect, because he has written a very good book called The Death of Science with a co-author, and I can't remember the co-author. It really puts together the arguments that I largely agree with. He's got a theory about where the virus came from, which is probably right, but so he too gets contentious in part. But he is such a fine scientist. He has worked on the HIV virus, CD4, CD8, and he had a really interesting vaccine all ready to go. Now, I know he got several members of like-thinking people with him, they're all medics. He's was professor of oncology at St. George's Hospital, and he specialized in skin cancers. But he's such a good general thinker, and I do follow him and trust his judgment and argument implicitly. And he'll be able to explain to you. But I do know, and it's not just the medics, but because I wrote time and time again with various ideas to the Minister of Health, and I never got a reply. And I gather a lot of medics got together, tried to see the powers that be in those conducting the fight against COVID, and they weren't even listened to, often not even interviewed.
Well, during that time, I mean, some of the biggest heretics were the ones that were saying, hey, we need to keep exercising. We need to, eat a variety of clean food. We need to spend time with our families and friends because community is important. We need to sleep well. We need to, meditate, and all these things that we knew worked regardless of whatever the virus was. And in America, especially in the UK now, we also in this year and a half, let's work on getting the nation's, obesity crisis under control. We know that people who have pre-existing medical conditions are far more likely to die. And so not only some of the science that people were talking about, whether it was, medications or vaccinations, alternative ones, but even lifestyle changes were demonized. How dare you imply that, my grandmother died from anything other than COVID when she was 300 pounds and a 60-a-day smoker? It was ridiculous. And at the back end of that, there was a complete refusal, at least in America, I don't know how it is in the UK, to acknowledge any of the things that were done wrong. Not only punitively, which should have happened, but just in the conversation. All right, here's what we did well, here's what we did wrong. We think Sweden did this really well. We think the UK did this, Portugal did this. Let's start taking, what worked best from around the world. And next time we have something similar, then we'll have a different plan. But it was nauseating because there was not only, like you said, a resistance to people that had some very, very, real ideas, whether it was lifestyle changes or medicine, but there was a refusal then to acknowledge that anything was done wrong on the back end, thus setting us up for the exact same thing to happen again.
Yeah, well, the thing that really angered me, and I think angered a lot of other veterinary surgeons, was when Boris Johnson came out and said, we've got this new wonder drug, which we're using now, called dexamethasone. Now, dexamethasone is a drug that the Americans, I think, invented in the 1970s. And the vets certainly have been using dexamethasone for non-responsive virus pneumonia, usually on the second or third day. And I cannot believe that the medics didn't use it. But it seemed there was a disconnect between the really good clinical respiratory specialists and the advice that was being fed through from the government. And vitamin D, if the government had just said, go on, just take vitamin D, we can't do much at the moment, we haven't got a vaccine, get your vitamin D levels up, because, again, to go back to Prof. Dalgleish, he argues extremely cogently about the vitamin D being a cheap and cheerful immunomodulator.
Yeah, and for us here, the outside was empty, for months and months and months, and we get vitamin D for free. You don't even have to buy the pills. Just go outside. It's 100 degrees. You take the dog for a walk in your shorts and your t-shirt, and you'll get a solid amount of vitamin D then. So that was what was so sad, is that when you were telling everyone to stay indoors and not have any vitamin D, you were just compounding the problem. So, well, I want to transition to, let's start at the beginning of your diagnosis. So what were some of the warning signs that, you weren't feeling well or something, wasn't right? And then walk me through you initially even finding out that you had this.
Well, first of all, anything I'm suggesting, I'm not suggesting as a doctor. It's not medical advice. I want to qualify this, repeatedly through the interview, I think. But Christina, my wife, had the idea that we'd rent a house for 2 weeks in France. We lived in France. We love France. We're Francophiles for most of the time. So we decided to rent the house near one of our daughters who lives out there. And we'd rent it for 2 weeks, and we'd rotate friends and family within those 2 weeks. So we'd get to see several people within those 2 weeks. Annabelle, who and her husband and children, who'd prepared a wonderful meal for us to fly out. As we flew out that evening, we had this wonderful, I think it was paella, and a lovely sweet, and of course some French cheeses. And I probably had, unusual for me, probably 2 to 3 glasses of wine. But I would have had nothing else. And I went to bed and felt absolutely stuffed. And I felt as if I could muster a really good fart or a really good burp, or get something to move on in my upper gut to move towards the lower gut, I'd feel comfortable. It was one of those times where you think you really wish you could be sick because you knew you're going to. and you never are. Anyway, I wasn't. And this feeling just continued right through the first week. There was all this wonderful food coming and going, and I just didn't fancy any of it. In the second week, I started to go, at least I thought I was starting to go yellow. And at the end of the second week, I was yellow and went off to see the GP. He sent me for an MRI scan the next day. And he said, when you get back to England, go straight in to get some attention, because we think we can see a small lesion and one of your blood enzymes is up, one of your liver enzymes is up. You can imagine, as I was going yellow, particularly being a vet and particularly being a keen gardener, I was thinking in terms of viral disease, or perhaps one of the hepatitides, either 1, 2, or 3. So I was fairly laid back. I didn't think of anything. I thought I'd be on something to support my liver, probably a course of Cristopen, and I'd be as right as rain. So I go into casualty in Bristol, and they triage me straight through to hepatology, where this wonderful Dr. Rees, or Professor Rees probably he is, took over my care. Bloods were run straight away. I had an MRI scan, and I think I had a CT scan. And then they carried out an endoscopy fairly soon after that, and came back to me and said, we found what looks like a malignant tumor in your duodenum. We failed to take meaningful biopsies because of the kink of the duodenum, the natural crook in the duodenum, and the fact that the tumor is in the way, which seems slightly ironical. Anyway, they were unable to take anything but, well, it was not a meaningful sample. But they said, we're going to put a stent in your bile duct. And they tried by approaching the bile duct from the duodenum at the same time as they were taking the biopsies and having a look round. But because of the overgrowth of the tumor around the bile duct exit into the duodenum, they were unable to push a stent up to open up the flow of bile. Obviously, it was a flow of bile spilling into my blood that was giving me the bile pigments, that was giving me my colour. I wasn't feeling overly ill. I was just under par and completely off my food. Anyway, they then used a fantastic technique which I'd never seen before, where with ultrasound examining my liver, they went on the right side, just in front of my hip, at the point that you'd say you get a stitch, just at that point there. And then they fed a fine cannula, I suppose it was, across my liver until they picked up a bile duct. So they found a branch of the bile duct tree, a peripheral one, and fed it through thick as the branches went thicker and thicker and thicker until they got to the bile duct itself. They then fed this tube down the bile duct. So now they're approaching the blockage from the other way. They tried from the intestine. They were now coming from above the intestine, and they managed to put a stent in from that position successfully. And almost immediately, my color started to improve.
So now you have this diagnosis. Obviously, you had this jaundice that started to improve after they opened up the bile duct again. Walk me through them discovering, the severity of this tumor that you had.
Well, they said they couldn't, again, because they couldn't get proper access. They couldn't tell how far down the duodenum distally the tumor ran. They were fairly certain it's malignant from the characteristics that they could see visually. So then they, with the scans, they say that there were no secondaries. But they described it as stage 4, which I don't quite understand why they did, but they described it as stage 4. And the options were then given to me that if I wanted a complete cure, I should go for an operation called a Whipple. Now, which Whipple is major butchery? It's 5 to 7 hours of the most skilled surgery you can possibly imagine. But initially, in many patients, to get to it, you actually have to resect major blood vessels, tie them off, move them away from the area to provide access for what you want to do. It involves taking a portion of the stomach, a portion of the pancreas, a portion of the liver, and a portion of the duodenum, of course, and then joining the ileum to what remains of the stomach. But I was up for this. I was totally up for a complete cure. I couldn't see, because the other option was chemo. There's no immunotherapy. The chemo is pretty nasty, and I've always been frightened of chemo in any event. So I spent 3 weeks getting rid of the bile. I spent 3 weeks getting fit, and I was fairly fit and getting fitter in terms of walking. I was walking a couple of miles a day, no problem. Because all through this time, I felt reasonably well in myself in every other direction. And so I get myself, because you have to have, I think it's called a CPET, you have to get a pulmonary cardiovascular exercise test before they will allow, I think, any patient, but certainly older patients, to have major surgery, so that the risks are in that department are minimized. So I then get to this point. I get myself through this test, which is quite hard work. Involves walking really fast for 6 minutes, and you have to cover a set distance. But of course, this is sorry, that's what I trained as. But you are in fact on a treadmill with gas analysis and all the rest of it. You're hooked up to every bit of kit you can imagine. So then I get to see the prof who's going to do the surgery, and of course, the one thing I found disappointing, and my care has been fantastic throughout. I've got nothing to complain about, except the delays. So instead of having this conversation with the prof while I was getting cleared up from the bile, they waited until I was clear and fit, and then I saw the surgeon. And I'd like to have seen the surgeon before, because what he had to say was an absolute bombshell. He basically said to me, "You're 84, you'll go into surgery at 84, you'll come out at 94. He said there are many complications within the operation time and many complications afterwards. The complications during surgery, the obvious ones like stroke, heart attack, blood loss, being unable to carry out the surgery the way they want to. And afterwards, you've got similar risks of stroke, heart attack, the pancreatic surgery leaking, which means you're digesting your own intestines, or you're digesting your own blood vessels from the outside as opposed to food from the inside, and all the other complications of operating on older people. And so I then thought seriously about checking out. So I asked him, I said, and he was in his 60s, I said, what would you do if you were me at 84? And he said, I wouldn't have it done. Because then on palliative care, you'll have a reasonable time with your family, and you won't get the prolonged recovery and all the very considerable secondary problems during recovery of even young men or young women. So I chickened out.
I wouldn't say it was chickening out. I think you just made an educated decision.
Yeah, okay.
To give you some grace, I wouldn't be chickening out. I mean, it's so sad, because when we started having this conversation and I learned about this procedure that you were considering having, I'm almost 100% sure that my wife's best friend, who passed away in her early 40s after a surgery, after a very aggressive abdominal cancer, who bled out from a liver laceration, or maybe, you know, the artery not being corrected properly, whatever it was. You know, she would have had a longer, probably a better quality of life had she not had that procedure, because she died, I think, less than 48 hours after she came out of anesthetic. So it's a, you know, this is an important conversation. I've said this very many times. I just want to kind of put this on the balance as well. To me, and I'm not a you know, a physician, I'm just a, you know, paramedic, but we are taught a decent level of science and anatomy and physiology. And the premise that to kill a cancer, you just Agent Orange the whole body, and then fingers crossed, let's hope that, you know, the good cells survive, really, you know, still feels like medieval science at best. It really doesn't make a lot of sense. And you talked about immunotherapy. I think now we're finally actually making progress on real cancer treatment. What is it about chemo that scared you? And, you know, what were you seeing as far as the efficacy of chemotherapy at that time, global chemotherapy?
Well, it just struck me as completely wrong way of doing things. As you say, you're poisoning the whole body in the hope that you poison enough of the bad guys. That's really what did it. And also, the other ironical thing, I always thought of all the cancers I don't want to get is pancreatic cancer. And I haven't actually got pancreatic cancer, but it's classified as pancreatic cancer. And the other thing I hate is endoscopy via mouth. And I was in for both. And I'm sure I'm in for some more later on as well. But that's beside the point. But it's just as a vet, that just seems to poison the whole body seems so ridiculous. And it's unfortunate. I mean, also most chemo follows radical surgery first. So you try and attack the tumor in one way or another, first of all, and then you move on to mopping up with chemo. Well, of course, they can't get to this tumor to take it out, although histotripsy might have worked, which is another really interesting technology.
Expand on that, because I know if you've got a solid organ like a liver, you know, specifically a tumor there, that this actually is proving to be very effective and minimally invasive.
Yeah, I mean, it's in its early stages. Vets have been playing with it since 2006. But some biomechanical engineer had the bright idea of focusing ultrasound. So, I mean, I'm used to ultrasound and still am used to ultrasound purely on imaging. And that's a linear set of ultrasound emitters, and then mathematics to produce an image from the bounce back. Histotripsy, I don't know quite how they had the idea, but histotripsy works by having like a satellite dish, absolutely covered in ultrasound producers, rather like pixels really, and they're all focused to where you want to treat. And the joy of it is that it doesn't produce heat locally. Certainly, if you do it in bursts, it doesn't. And I haven't any first-hand experience of this at all. So it's only what I was involved by sending some mice to have. We had some mice with tumors under their skin, which was liver, the xenographic mice with liver tumors, and it saved their lives very well. But that was only through a tiny bit of skin, and it was only something the size of a broad bean. So the way this works is you get the tissues vibrated, and all liquids in the body would have gas. They have to have gas, or either in the red cells or in solution. And of course, had I been teaching this, but of course the technology came after I left teaching, I think I would have probably made the analogy of bends, because as you know, bends, part of the problem with bends is nitrogen bubbling out of the blood. although it's not a direct analogy, it's a good starting point if you're trying to get the idea across. So the ultrasound causes the fluid that you're targeting to release gas in and out of solution in milliseconds. So you are, in a way, sort of, people described it as boiling, which I think is totally erroneous, because there's no heat involved. This is a cold process. And the bubbles coming in and out of solution destroy the cell membranes. And you now have got, instead of cells, you've got a cell soup. And the way they've developed this technique, it has to be coupled through gas-free water, as you probably would gather, because as you deliver the beam, if you're losing part of it because you're bubbling gas out of the water that you're going through, so that they're using, instead of a gel, they use a water bath on your tummy to get to your liver. That couples the ultrasound. It allows the ultrasound to then go on to penetrate the skin, and they target it on the tumor. There is another ultrasound scanner actually helping position the target help position the focused energy on the target. It then is rather like a 3D printer. It then passes across, it knows what it's got to do. It knows the parameters within it in which it's working, and it then tracks across the tumor millimeter by millimeter, destroying it as it goes. And again, on the ultrasound, you can actually see the destructed. Well, it's a pool of gubbins. It's a pool of tissue. And now, there's one really exciting thing: is it is in its early stages. I'm jumping the gun. I'm an internal optimist. I really think it's going to be game-changing for cancer surgeons. Amongst one of the advantage amongst which is a phenomena called the abscopal effect. Ab being away, from the Latin away, scopal being target. So it's an away from target effect. And what this is you, and I have seen this, and as indeed most vets have. We used to often treat tumors of the skin with liquid nitrogen, and we'd often do this in a standing animal, which was quite dangerous if the tumors were between their back legs. So quite often we'd treat the ones we could safely get to, and leave the ones between the hind legs. And in due course, the ones in the hind legs, untreated, would finally fall away. We never used the name abscopal effect, but the medics have a name for it, because I think they occasionally see it with radiotherapy and one or two other therapies. And my hunch is that because this is a complete lysate, it's not heat change proteins. You haven't gone and cooked the protein. You haven't done anything except release the juices. And now I think you've got a really potent antigen, because what happens next, and when you treat these patients, is that this lysate over the next month is mopped up, and the tumor is completely gone. And I'm just looking all the time at literature to see if people are starting to tabulate abscopal effects following histotripsy. And the other interesting thing is the Americans, I think they allowed it to be used for only tumors in the liver, pancreas, and kidney. And Mr. Wes Sweeting, whatever, I can't remember his name properly, but Wes Sweeting, somebody gave some money to Cambridge, to Addenbrooke's, as I understand it. This is secondhand knowledge. He said, the Americans have already done this. You've got patients who are going to die anyway. Let's scrub rerunning the tests over here as well. If the Americans have done it, they're using it, we will do it. And that's, I think, the state of affairs at the moment.
I think it's very exciting. And when you break apart these tumors, I'm assuming then you're educating the immune system and they start attacking the ones, as you said, in other parts of the body. So it makes perfect sense. If you're able to break away that protective coating they've given themselves to try and be, insidious, now all of a sudden they're discoverable. And now you're sending a global response to anywhere else in the body.
Yeah, that's right. And I was explaining this to one of my grandsons, and he said, well, if they do that to you, I hadn't got any secondaries at that point. I've now got secondaries, and I got a toy with the idea as to whether perhaps I have a go at that. But he said, well, will it act in reverse? Although the primaries have normally been dealt with in most surgical situations, if you did do that, would it be man enough to attack the primary?
Yeah, it's an interesting question.
Yeah.
Well, I want to go to your own patient advocacy and your treatment plan. How are you doing right now? I want to check in on you. Are you still good at the moment to keep talking?
Yeah, I am, darling. Yeah, I'm just. You probably gather I'm not thinking as fast as I normally do.
There's no need to think fast. Everything's coming out very, very coherently, so you're fine. I promise.
Okay. Well, first of all, all my ideas are not medical recommendations. The second thing is that I would, if I had my time again, I would start off by trying to find an open-minded GP who would talk me through conventional treatment, but would also talk me through and handhold me through other treatments, repurposed drugs, and coming off piece generally. Only, not that I'd want to get him struck off in any way, but only to perhaps allow me to facilitate my having a blood test perhaps once a month and or an MRI scan every 3 months, something like that. Because I think that if I'd done that and had them on side and had that backup of knowledge that I was not damaging the National Health Service nor my liver by what I was doing, then I think that'd have been a really good starting point. And I've got a couple of clinical hunches that I think bear that out, but they'll come out as we talk.
From watching from the outside, it seems that sadly one of the biggest missing elements was communication, whether it's hospitals not being able to read each other's patient information, whether it's certain departments not talking to each other. And I think retroactively, the best way of talking through some of these is, you've already highlighted that the physicians should be brave enough to talk about the pros and the cons right from day one, not kind of avoid that subject because you're allowing that patient to weigh up the risks. But secondly, I think it's important if you could do it again, and this isn't a regret conversation, it's just that you've experienced what you've experienced and delays and lack of communication, some other things, and it's not a blaming thing, it's just unpack that, the way it has. But if you could go back and say, all right, I am going to start creating my own treatment plan, and I'm going to, I'm aware of some of these alternative treatments, and I'm going to look at some of these, dietary choices from day one after the diagnosis. Talk to me about what you would start pursuing right from the beginning.
Yeah, I'll come back to that, Jamie, if you can remind me to come back to it, because I don't want to give the impression that my treatment hasn't been anything but really good. The delays, I think the delays, I'm sure, could be organized by better management. But the communication that really matters has been good, in as much that there's a nurse looking after me who has an overview of the specialties who are treating me. And they have these meetings, as I understand it, every Friday, where it's a multidisciplinary meeting. Everyone sits in, everyone contributes. So at that level of communication, it's really good. In fact, in the 9 months I've been under treatment, the communications have actually improved because the Bristol imaging can now be sent to the Swindon imaging, which when we started, they couldn't. And we got them purely by chatting up the radiographers, and they sort of did it behind everyone's back. And there are, you can see really good communications. For instance, the way the drugs are now on a computer, when you move from ward to ward, or I was on a trolley for 3 days, they had all my data because it was on a laptop. So there's lots that they're doing right, I think. And as I say, my care has been wonderful. Everyone working in National Health Service, their heart is in the right place. I just think they need some help. They need some help from business to streamline, have a good look and see what's wasted. They seem to be frightened to move without someone further up the chain ticking it off. That's what it feels like, because you spend weeks sitting there doing nothing, waiting for the next procedure. Or I've actually had to stay overnight because the drugs came up so late from the pharmacy. Well, that was a bed wasted. It's, simple things like that seem to be, it could be addressed. So, and I have got several constructive things. I'm not sure whether I've got a mark against me as being Bell happy, and she'll end up with a daffodil in my backside, or whether I've got a bell against me for being controversial. But I try and be as controversial as I dare.
Yeah. I think because in my world, I come from a place where obviously we're doing certain things pre-hospital, and then when we get to the ER, so certainly if it's something with a relative amount of urgency, things are done very quickly, scans and blood tests and all kinds of things. So when, for example, you're not getting multiple scans to see a tumor's progression in your case, for example, or like you said, just a long period of time between each of these levels where the patient doesn't feel like they have autonomy. They're kind of, just waking up every morning. Okay, is it going to be today? It's by no means, disparaging against the men and women that are working in HS. It's, again, the inefficiency of the system, and how can we roll it back to maybe a time where there was a lot better communication. And I think this, just like we talked about with COVID, people get all, as they say in America, butthurt when you question things. But if you're questioning things to try and help improve it, not just talk poorly about it, then that's a constructive criticism. That's something that you're trying to take someone's experience and then say, all right, this didn't seem to be the best way of doing it. What can we do to improve, so that you don't have to have, behind the back conversations to get your own x-rays to the hospital that needs them.
Yeah. So you asked me, what did you ask me, Jamie?
So rather than kind of go on, when you had each of these things done, let's go back and now play it out how you think it should have. So let's talk about everything from the imaging to some of the off-label treatments that you want to highlight today, even though, as you said, you're not a medical expert and this is your gut feeling when it comes to medicine. But if you could go back in time now and play it out again in the sequence that you would like to have seen it, so that maybe someone listening who's just got a recent diagnosis can start copying that, how would you like to have seen it played out so that you had autonomy and you felt like you were exploring some of these treatments at a time where they maybe could have been more effective?
Well, the first thing was, one of the nurses said to me very early on, "You'll never feel as well as you do today." And I think I didn't really take that on board. And I think it is things that are said to you that you may not think through properly. And also the other thing is, I didn't realize when I had a duodenal stent put in, which was I did the moment I was vomiting on solid food all the time. I thought that the duodenal stent would go in, and I'd then be able to eat again, eat solid food again. And that's not the case. And that little silly things like that mistakes I've made. But I would like to have had a doctor I could sit down with on a regular basis and say, I don't want to do chemo, because we didn't get to the point where I went on to chemo. From the surgeon, I was passed on to chemo, oncology. And oncology said, sorry, not chemo, oncology. And they said, well, you're 84, you go on to chemo, traditional chemo, and you'll come out at 94. You'll have a pretty nasty experience during that. do you want to do it? And I asked the same question. If you were 84, would you do it? And again, they said no. And so then that's when I really started on histotripsy and everything else. So I started reading around, and I came across someone who I'd known by reputation before, and namely Professor Angus Dalgleish, who I think by some he's considered a maverick, but for all the wrong reasons, in my opinion. It's almost as if there's actually a protective. Everyone's setting out to protect themselves or their own position without intellectually challenging themselves. And this, I think, is reputation and also money. It seems that decisions are made by people without them having every fact at their fingertips. And what really makes me think this is true is because I can often go to even the consultants and say, what do you think about this particular treatment or idea? And it's been published in peer-reviewed papers perhaps for 6 months, and they're not aware of it. And I find that shocking, that there's no mechanism, perhaps their PA or someone, just to pick up and just summarize, just send him the conclusion. So anyway, I came across Professor Dalgleish really in relation to looking at some of these repurposed drugs. And I recommend to anybody who's in my position to look at his interviews with Dr. John Campbell, who is a nurse, and he interviews. They're not all contentious. It's not all contentious subjects, but he gets people in of reasonable reputation, and then gets them to talk about their views. And so I listened to everything Angus Dalgleish had to say, and went to him privately. He's retired, so therefore he's my sort of hand-holding third opinion, if you like. And several things come through very, very quickly and very, very easily. Things that anyone can do. Things like vitamin D. If you listen to his views on vitamin D, and vitamin D, as I understand it, even now amongst the medical profession, is contentious. I think in writing, I'm saying almost every cell in the body has a vitamin D receptor. Certainly all those in the immune system have a vitamin D receptor. And he came across a colleague who'd looked at vitamin D and the results of chemotherapy. And they noticed that those who showed great success with chemotherapy had relatively high levels of vitamin D in their blood. And those who failed miserably could even have none. And he was telling another surgical colleague of this, and this man scoffed at him and said, no, that can't be right, absolute rubbish. Anyway, I gather a month later, this friend came back to him and said, you're absolutely right. I sent a student off to have a look at the old data, and you're absolutely right. It matches. Now, that doesn't prove anything, but it does match. So immediately I put myself on a high vitamin D. And vitamin D is a sad story, really, because it seems to me that once we cured rickets with a given level of vitamin D, we forgot all about it. And we didn't realize that vitamin D is important in so many other diseases, and particularly where the immune system is concerned. Also, we forget we live in the Northern Hemisphere. Now, Christina and I, when we lived in France, we had a routine blood with our GP, and he rang us up and said, look, you're low on vitamin D. Now, that was a couple living healthily, veg-wise and all the rest of it, in the south of France, and being out in the garden quite a lot of the time, still needing vitamin D. So Prof. Dalgleish wants me in excess of 100. Forget the units, because there are two different units, and I always mix them up. But just 100 units, between 100 units and 200. Above 200 is probably not recommended, but it's very, very safe stuff. Very safe stuff. And I think that the sort of level that most people should be happy with is sort of 56, 60 units. But so that's one thing, and that's something that one can do cheaply. You can do it without interfering with anyone. Can't see a GP in the country, particularly now after the COVID argument, that wouldn't want you to take a bit of vitamin D. The second thing is that he came across was low dose naltrexone. Now, naltrexone is sort of son of naloxone. I think it's something they use in drug addicts in a withdrawal program. They start them off, I think, about 50 mg, and slowly they wean them over time. I haven't a clue what time. I've never read this aspect of low-dose naltrexone. And then eventually wean them off completely and then stop the drug completely. And they did notice, or this particular doctor noticed, and he must have been really quite bright, because my first reaction was to this would be, oh, these guys want to go back on opium. But he noticed that a bunch of patients would come to him and say, look, can we go back on this stuff? Because a lot of my symptoms of rheumatoid arthritis and various autoimmune conditions have improved towards the end of my treatment. And this was when, of course, they were taking low-dose naltrexone, which now is now described as a treatment, i.e. low-dose naltrexone. Nitroxine, yeah. And by low dose, they mean, I understand, about 4.5 mg a day. And you categorically must not go over that, because the effect no longer works. And I think it works by in two receptors. One of the opioid receptor. Anyway, it is and again immunomodulatory. It really enhances the activity of the immune system. And the Prof has written with one of his colleagues a paper which is well worth ferreting down and reading. So there are two things that the medics could do. Low-dose naltrexone, I'm not sure about the licensing situation, but there's a huge number of people who now use it for a variety of conditions, not only cancer. So they're the two obvious ones, which are not too confrontational, I wouldn't have thought, for the NHS. And then you come to the two that I'm really interested in. Well, I'm interested in both those. I do both, at least. Well, the one downside of low-dose naltrexone is you cannot take it with codeine, and you cannot take it with opioids. Although I think the Prof has a regime that you can get around that a little bit, because if you take it when you're taking opioid painkillers or codeine, you get withdrawal symptoms. You go cold turkey. You'll give yourself cold turkey, which I can imagine from the descriptions is pretty nasty. So then that's the one contraindication. And I think it's contraindicated if you're on warfarin as well. But I'm not sure it is with the other blood thinners. But it's just, as I say, I'm not talking as a medic. Then you get to these other wormers. Now, these have a phenomenal record and a phenomenal safety record. In veterinary medicine, certainly, and they all have a huge preclinical research bibliography. I'm literally thousands and thousands of papers about in petri dishes, mice, all the species for worming, including the clinical stuff that we did in the horse. And they are wormers. And if you look at the easiest way to convince yourself whether it's worth doing or not is to look at whatever pathways your tumor is, or just say put in a decent search engine, academic papers on this drug, thibenzole, or fenbendazole, or membendazole, any of that family, and cancers. And you'll come up with various pathways that it interferes with, depending on what drug you're looking up. Be things like apoptosis, angiogenesis, and various interference in the way cancer grows. And the most exciting thing is that thibenzole family interfere with GLUT1, which of course is the use of sugar. And of course, cancers love sugar. So to find something that knocks sugar on the head is a bonus. And then you do the same for ivermectin, which you find an even wider spectrum of activity. And the joy of both these drugs, they don't seem to touch normal cells. They only target malignant cells. And so for all those reasons, plus the huge safety profile that there is, certainly in animals, and of course in man to some extent, because of course ivermectin has been used in, I think, 1.5 billion doses to cure river blindness. Now, the downside of this argument is twofold. One is these drugs have a preservative. And if you're going to take a veterinary drug that's primarily meant for a wormer, which is given one dose and then a dose monthly and then subsequently several months ahead of time, then you're taking this wormer once. You're taking it at quite a high dose, a higher dose than you'd use for cancers. But you're just belting the gut with that one dose for that one day, including the preservative for that one dose and that one day. And so therefore, if you're then going to turn around and say, I'm going to take some of this every day, well, it's fine saying that the drug is safe, which we know it is, but we don't know that taking a preservative that regularly is as safe, because no one would have bothered to do the work. And although I think the risk is minimal, as far as I remember, in both of them, it's an obscure alcohol, but it's in tiny amounts. But technically, yes, you might be hurting yourself there. So it'd be very easy to, in fact, it is easy to buy a product from India which hasn't got the preservatives in it. It is just a tablet. And so that's the way I'd approach it. And when you come to ivermectin, which, as I say, has got a phenomenally high profile in man because of the 1.5 billion doses given to treat river blindness, that's quite apart from other things like scabies and various other chronic infectious and parasitic infections. You've got the same thing. You're giving quite a high dose, but you're only giving it once or twice. And it does save a lot of children from going blind.
Am I right in thinking, because I've heard people talk about this, it's actually the solution that some of these vaccines are in that are causing these concerning side effects? And kind of to your point, the actual, the part, the drug that's supposed to attack the virus in itself overall is safe, but some of the solutions that they're putting in some of these vaccines are actually the parts, just as you said with the preservative, that are causing some of these side effects and are technically unneeded if they were put in the right solution.
Well, I've certainly read the odd paper about this, but I wouldn't like to comment because I haven't looked at it in detail. I'd like to get on to a vaccine later on, but no, I can believe that could be the case. But because, well, I mean, just simply when I went to Africa, I was given the rabies vaccine, and it was a duck egg vaccine. So people who are allergic to eggs certainly couldn't have the vaccine. So from that point of view onwards, yes, I can imagine that does happen. And I have seen references to it, but I wouldn't dream of commenting on that because I haven't read around it.
You mentioned apoptosis, which, if I'm not mistaken, is cell death, in a good way. So you see that with ketosis and some of those other things. And then angiogenesis. So I'm assuming that what you're saying with some of the earlier drugs, knowing that a tumor needs a blood supply to keep growing, that if you are promoting cell death of unneeded cells and opposing the ability to create a capillary network in a tumor, that those two effects are going to be very powerful when it comes to stopping a tumor from growing.
Yeah, yeah, and the same is true of certain nutrients, because one of the things that I really regret, and I can't do anything about, is before I had the stent, I was eating a lot of vegetables, a lot of fiber, a lot of fruit. So I was attacking the tumor both ways, both with fruit, all the nutrients that remember, the natural nutrients have a similar way of bringing about apoptosis and angiogenesis and all the rest of it. And they're just two that are fairly easy to understand because they're self-explanatory. But I should have pointed out what angiogenesis was, but anyway, thank you for that, Donny. Yeah, and the sad thing is that also my microbiome is up the chute, and we haven't even touched on that because lots of, particularly chemo, won't work if you don't have the right cadre of spread of bugs in the gut. There are certain bugs that are actually required as part of the metabolism of making the chemo efficacious, and it won't work without. And similarly, they're getting something they're beginning to I mean, again, it's so exciting. Both these things are exciting, and without computers we couldn't do it, because you're getting to the point there's so much information, no one human brain could contain it all. But I can't have fiber, I can't have all the things that should keep my microbiome in good nick. Coupled with the fact that the gut absorption is reduced because the pancreas is embarrassed, so you don't digest it well, and the duodenum isn't functioning because you've got a stent in there messing about. So you're being treated with this particular condition. You're being treated really well by everybody, but a lot of your possible benefits from normal nutrition are not available to you.
Well, you mentioned vaccines, so let's talk about Mycobacterium vacci.
Yeah. Well, this is absolutely fascinating. About 15 years ago, I had cancer of the bladder, and I was absolutely amazed when they decided to zap them in situ. I don't know what they used, whether they used loops, thermo loops, or laser. I don't know what they did. I think they might have lasered them. And so as a follow-up for my surgical treatment, they instilled BCG vaccine. I can't remember the exact intervals, but weekly for several weeks. And the argument there was a BCG, which is a live vaccine, technically could give you TB if you were immunocompromised. Just stimulates the immune system to such an extent it shrugs off the rest of the neoplastic tissue in the bladder. And it was really interesting that when I got to talk to Dr. Dalgleish, that he had a very similar vaccine. And I said to him, because you may remember, Jamie, when COVID broke out, I suggested everyone did as much as they could to boost their immune system and stimulate their immune system into action. One of the things I did suggest was, and looked at, is could I have a dose of BCG? And when I put this to Prof. Dalgleish, he said one dose would have been fine. The second dose would actually make things worse for cancers, because you then get a mild inflammatory response second time round, which would be contraindicated. But he then went on to tell me about a vaccine that he has made. He's done all the clinical trials on. That he already had, at the time of outbreak, I think he had several thousand doses of this stuff on the stocks, together with the science to go behind it, and together with a company making it. And they just wanted the license signed off, because all the safety stuff had been done. And this was based on, I think it's heat treated, it may be formalized, I don't know, but based on Mycobacterium vaccae, VACCAE, i.e., as found in the cow. And, from vache from the French, or vacca from the Latin. It seems incredibly effective. And what is his argument? The argument he puts together is, when you're young and you're guddling around in all the mud and all the fecal material of your dogs and your horses and your cows, or walking in the countryside, you are building up the immune system, which takes us back to the microbiome. But you're educating your immune system. Children with snotty noses at school their immune system is being educated day by day. And then from sort of late 20s on, your immune system is still fairly competent. But at 50, your immune system becomes progressively less competent. And so his idea is to boost the immune system in a general way, just to generally stimulate the immune system, not to make a vaccine for a specific bug, not to say this is a flu jab or this is a what jab or whatever jab. It's to say, let's get the immune system in the best possible nick so that our bodies can fight whatever's coming. And he means whatever's coming, I think bacteria as well as viruses. And I think it's called MM110, I think the name of the vaccine. Anyway, again, the Ministry of Health weren't interested in listening to him, as I understand it. You must ask him about this. And I asked him, I said, have you got the odd dose lying around I can have? Because the interesting thing about this is, it's given, do you ever remember coming TB testing with me, where we'd put a tiny little bead of tuberculin within the thickness of the skin of the cow, and then we go back and measure it with calipers. 2 days later, we used to have a mammalian one and an avian one, and you compared the two, and either the cow was carrying TB or it wasn't.
I don't remember that with you, but I had that done as a firefighter over and over again on the forearm, sub-Q.
Did you? Yeah. This is intradermal. Anyway, it's extremely effective. From all the research work, it's extremely effective. So I asked him, could I have a dose? Have you got one lying around? I wouldn't mind if it's been out of date, to be honest. It's only going to go in the skin. And he said, no. He said, but I have. There is a manufacturer who's actually making a capsule version, which you can swallow. In fact, God, I must take some. I've forgotten to take them. And I said, well, I asked him last time I saw him, actually, how does that work? And he said, well, it goes down and talks to the Peyer's patches. That's the immune system. But there's a huge amount of immune material in the gut. And it goes down and talks to, shake hands with the immune material, the white cell material, the Peyer's patches in particular, and stimulates immunity, which, of course, I had read the odd paper about the microbiome, where your body reacts to not only live organisms that are in the gut, but reacts to dead DNA from the gut. And I thought, well, that overlaps that. And I've, of course, because I'm paying for these consultations, I can't sit down and bend his ear for ages, otherwise I'd be bankrupt. But I'd love him to talk me through, or I'd love to be one of his students and go to one of his lectures, particularly on this subject, because it seems so basic, so sensible, so sound, and so safe that, again, it needs seriously looking at.
Well, the safety and efficacy, when you also factor in that, for example, in your situation, the alternative is a Whipple or chemotherapy, it also reframes what really is the risk, because comparatively, the other options are far worse. So if you're taking a lot of these drugs that, as you said, are being used billions of times all over the planet, and it's an air quotes off-label use, but we know the drug is safe, then, yes, compared to doing nothing at all, someone may say, oh, there might be this side effect, this preservative, but when you compare it to the Whipple or chemo, all of a sudden it reframes that risk dramatically as well.
Yeah, and also you must remember that lots of drugs are found to be useful for something for which they were not invented. Of course, the classic being, oh God, what's it called? The blue pill.
Viagra, yeah.
Yeah. Now, that was designed as a cardiovascular drug, as I understand it, and had this useful side effect.
Yeah, which is why when people have chest pain as a paramedic, if they're on any of those pills, we can't give them nitro because it will bottom out their blood pressure because all the blood's already gone somewhere.
Yeah, well, they must be well endowed to lose a pint and a half.
All right. Well, I want to finish with the palliative element. Your nutrition. Pain management, nausea, anything that you want to impart as far as making a decision just to enjoy the quality of life and be comfortable. But before we do, are there any other areas, exploratory drugs, anything else you want to hit before we transition to that part?
Well, in fact, it leads us in there actually, because the two things that are most upsetting are, well, the most upsetting of all is the fact you can't eat what you want to eat because you haven't got much appetite and you can't have anything with texture. And if you go and blend bacon and eggs, it no longer tastes like bacon and eggs. And so I think, and you look at anyone, you look at the television, there's food advertisements. You look at your family and think, well, they're going to go back and have supper and they're going to be able to swallow some nice tasty stuff. That's the most shocking thing for this particular setup, which is the stent, a duodenal stent. So, and I think probably in this esophageal stent as well, I think they must be in a worse position actually. So that was the most shocking thing to me. The next, clinically, the most things I whinge about most is the nausea. And that was really difficult to control. We've now controlled it reasonably well. What they do, and again, the continuity is great and the nursing is great. They've obviously got a treatment plan and they don't often tell you what's ahead, probably for obvious reasons. But unfortunately, I've got a pretty good guess of what's ahead. So I don't really mind being told because, the options I've got. Anyway, that we won't go there, but so it's nausea. So they start off with simple anti-nausea drugs. There's a couple that they use as standard. And then they introduce a third when it wasn't being controlled properly. And bear in mind that the opiums that you're having for pain, which we'll come on to in a minute, they all make you constipated. But there's one anti-nausea drug, which I think is, I want to think it's called clopripride. I don't know. Because I'm a bit woozy on opium at the moment. I'm not sure that I got the name right, but there is one that actually stimulates gut motility. And so if they can get you on a bit of that, they quite like that because that helps gut motility. So then when you run out of that, so I now get to the point after several weeks that these drugs no longer control nausea. So they then put me on a drug called Levomol, which I thought, well, that's interesting. I'll look up this molecule. I have a look on the insert, and I thought, I know that molecule. Levomycel hydrochloride. Levomycel promazine. I thought, I know the levomycel molecule well. And I was racking my brain because I've been out of practice now for about 40 years, I suppose. And of course, it's another wormer, would you believe? But it's also a tranquilizer. So basically, they give me, can't remember how many 5 meg, I think, at night. And it runs, certainly stops you feeling sick overnight because it sends you to sleep. And the following day, nausea is either completely controlled or you add one or two of the earlier antiemetics on top of it. So at the moment, nausea is fairly well controlled, but nausea is one thing that really gets you, is You're not sick. I'm yet to be sick very often. But the constant feeling sick is not much fun. Then the pain is bizarre because very early on, I'd have a tiny amount of pain, and I'd take a paracetamol, and it would make me feel yucky and a tiny bit of pain, make me feel really good, and I can get on with the rest of the day. And then that slowly had to build up to the point, which was quite interesting because as vets, we were taught how toxic paracetamol can be. The medics are quite cavalier with it. They give it in the vein, and they're very happy for you to have a gram 4 times a day. And so that's what I'm on as a background. It's a very good drug, really. As a background painkiller, I am on a gram 4 times a day. And then on top of that, I'm on various forms of morphine, a long-acting one, and at the moment that's just about controlling pain, but I get breakthrough where they ask you to top yourself up with an extra oral short-acting dose of opioid. And then I think they'll move me on to things like self-injection. I presume that goes subcut, I don't know. And fentanyl, which is ironical. So that's where I started with Professor Janssen. And also I've had fentanyl as a pre-med, and I absolutely love it. For a few seconds you can enjoy it.
Well, it's so crazy as well, because as you said, that was the professor that you worked with who invented fentanyl. And then I end up becoming a paramedic and use naloxone, which is, what you're using now for your cancer treatment as well, to reverse opioids. Because I don't know if I think I left the fire service right when fentanyl specifically was starting to really take over, but it was heroin when I was there, black tar heroin. So, I was reversing opioids with this drug that you're on now. And now the one, through no fault of his own, but the synthetic opioid that he created, unbeknownst to him, one day would be abused in the black market, and now is killing. I mean, the opioid crisis. I know in America alone, we're losing 100,000 Americans every year. Now, you wouldn't think so because it doesn't even make any news story whatsoever. You saw the ticker of COVID. I mean, they had it on 24 hours a day. But if you do obesity, if you do opioids, if you do suicide, I mean, they're genocidal numbers, and they just turn their heads. So that's another entire conversation and different podcast. But I want to hit one area because I think it's so interesting asking you. This isn't something that's available to you in the UK, but being a veterinary surgeon and being there with you whilst you euthanize so many animals of all different species, because you didn't want that species, that animal, that person's pet to suffer anymore. And it was an end of life decision, whether it was, laminitis or whether it was an elderly German Shepherd. I've always seen that philosophy as compassion and empathy that we show our beloved pets. But there's a very, there are two very angry camps when it comes to this, when it comes to humans. This isn't an option, as you sit there right now in the UK, but, if you were in Portugal, if you were in the Netherlands, it would be something that would be available to you. Overall, philosophically, what is your perspective, having offered that grace to the animals in your care, of this being offered to the humans?
Well, first of all, some of my patients did survive.
Oh, yeah. Well, let's not get into that. Well, I guess you can't get struck off now.
Well, I regard it as a great privilege, actually. And I had one case that upset me and the owner, where I couldn't find a vein. And apart from that, I thought it was a great privilege and gave the animal a lovely sleep, if you like. It was more like a sleep than a death. I find the ethics of euthanasia really very difficult, and whether I do it myself, I don't know. Some days I'm in so much pain, I think, well, this is really not much fun living like this. And I'm not in serious pain yet, because my pain, I think, for the most part, is never more than about 6. And there must be people. I mean, I remember seeing someone with peritonitis in the bed next to me come in, and I've never seen anyone in so much pain in my life. In fact, that's one of the secondary problems that I might well have, and I asked them to make quite sure they just knock me out. But yeah, I find it really very difficult to know what I do. And also, if you're in that much pain, you've got to get yourself out to wherever you're going to get put down. What I have said, because one of the other difficult things that you've got to come to terms with is do not resuscitate. And you get asked that all the time. You get asked it virtually the moment you arrive in hospital, which I think is doesn't say much for the confidence in what they're doing.
Not a glass half full conversation.
Yeah. So in the end, I came up with my own definition. And I said, I want you to put me down or not resuscitate me, assuming that I am your 84-year-old beloved grandfather who in no way is going to leave you a penny. And they all laughed at that, but I think that's because that's the way, in other words, if it's something simple, I thought of something the other day that, well, I suppose, a once-off anaphylaxis or something like that, I'd want them to have a go, but otherwise, if it's going to leave me a cabbage, I wouldn't, or don't.
Well, the example I always use is Gapper, so Mum's father, who I literally held his hand when he died, and he was bright yellow jaundice. He was a skeleton. We're having to use the sponge swab to try and just moisten his mouth. I don't think he could even swallow anymore. The quality of life was far beyond suffering, and I think that's the thing. Like you said, if you got peritonitis and you're young and healthy, and there's the other side of the treatment is you getting better and going back to your family, that's a whole different conversation. And I know euthanasia is very dangerous in the mental health side as well. People that feel helpless, that maybe some of these, again, off-label treatments like psychedelics could save their life and turn it around, and they have, 50 more years of thriving. But if it's something where there is no return, ALS, stage 4 cancers that are beyond any sort of reversal now, and to the point where the human is suffering before they get into that much pain, then, it's a tool in a toolbox, because it's that person's individual choice. And I think in Canada, there's been conversations of it being almost like forced upon certain communities. I don't know how true that is, but I hear that a lot. So you don't want to be promoting euthanasia to reduce numbers and, alleviate healthcare costs or whatever the thing might be. But I think, for someone to make that choice, I think it is important. And obviously some people subscribe to certain religious beliefs where they think it's a sin. But, for my own altruistic eyes, I think that, anything that alleviates suffering would be viewed as a good thing, as long as it is, truly end of life, and you're not going to be able to reverse whatever suffering that is and thrive again. If you are, then absolutely not. But if it's someone that the next day is going to be worse and the next day is going to be even worse, having seen that so many times, as a veterinary surgeon's son, and seeing the compassion and empathy and saying, okay, this is time now. They're blind, they're soiling themselves, they're just lying on the floor, breathing heavily, they are suffering, then it's just an interesting conversation, and getting your perspective, especially where you are at the moment. Philosophically, I think it's a voice that needs to be heard, which is yours.
Yeah, and the other thing we ought to also remind everyone that there are many, many more drugs that can be looked at to be repurposed. I know, which I didn't say, and even CPD. Well, do I mean that cannabis anyway?
Yeah,
I mean that
CPD.
Needs CBD. Yeah, it's a closed-mindedness, that the lack of inquiry that frightens me.
Where does that come from? In America, it's very evident. We have a profit-based healthcare system or disease management system where there's not, there potentially could be money in healthy people because you're behind gyms and nutrition and, organic farms. So there is money to be made in promoting health. But ultimately, where the customer is sick. And if you maintain that, then you keep making money. So it's very evident where the pressure against proactive, programs to make the nation healthier, some of these very inexpensive treatments that we've been talking about today, that is a threat, CBD, a threat to big pharma. I know that's a kind of broad generalization, but we know that. And we know the malpractice, for example, of Purdue Pharma with OxyContin, which was the precursor to the opioid crisis that we just discussed. So what are you seeing as far as the resistance of allowing innovation, allowing voices like Russell Foster's to be listened far sooner, rather than them having to fight tooth and nail for years before someone finally goes, oh yeah, you were right, just like me with the work week conversation?
Yeah, well, I think that good science takes ages to drip down into society, something like 30 years, I think, because dexamethasone's one. That's much longer than 30 years. I don't believe. Actually, I cannot believe that the medics didn't use. I think you said you used dexamethasone, didn't you?
I don't. We use. Oh my goodness. We used a steroid and it just fell out of my head, and I've only been out for 8 years. So that's embarrassing. But there was a steroid that we used for, anaphylaxis and some of those things that we'd use, but it would be, it wouldn't happen so much when we were in the back of the rig. It was more proactively injecting it. So by the time the patient was an hour into the ER visit, they're already starting to feel better, but it'll come to me in a minute. But yeah, it was one of the steroids.
With dexamethasone is longer acting than that. Probably one of the straight cortisones, I should think. But I think that's one thing. I don't understand why information takes so long to get to the general public. I've been saying for 40 years that people are going to be they're going to outlive their children because of obesity. And it's really simple things like that. How did you phrase your question, James? I haven't got it quite right.
No, you're fine. We went off on a tangent, but that's not a bad thing at all. I think we were actually just dovetailing from what we were talking about euthanasia, and then you went off again about more of the the drugs that.
Oh, you asked me. Yeah, you asked me
the challenges. Yeah, what are the challenges to that innovation? That's right.
Well, I compared with lots of members in my profession, I was more pro-pharma than most. Most vets are very cynical about big pharma. And I wasn't, for the reason I explained about Janssen. But I can't help feeling that is happening. The other thing I think is happening is that people aren't getting on top of their subject so that they can challenge everything that's being brought to them. And if they're going to turn it down for a really good reason. And particularly in this area because we were talking, I think I'm talking about, a £3,000 for 1 month's treatment, and you've got to have 6 for sure, or whatever, and then probably the following year or whatever it is. Why isn't the government putting aside some money to look at this? And then you wonder whether it's ignorance or it's the easy way out. And in some cases, really reluctantly, I think it's intellectual corruption. I know there was evidence of it with MMR. That was wicked, the scientists that rubbished the MMR vaccine. And then when the sugar industry rubbished the fat industry back in the 50s. And some of that, what I gather, was, but they didn't have peer-reviewed papers in the same way then, but some of it, those papers came out of a respectable university. It does worry me that you've got this background of vested interests that no one's coming clean about. And you and I discussed an approach that. Oh yes, there's one other thing I do want to touch on. Approached a guy who's promoting ivermectin in a very positive way. And a journalist approached me, and I got the distinct impression the way she was approaching it, although she was from an eminent broadcasting organization, she'd already made up her mind. I mean, that's unfair because I hope to get to speak to her again, but it wasn't someone open-minded probing me, testing me. And she was more interested in the clinical trials I've been involved in early on, rather than anything else. And that's awful. If journalists start from a premise that they're going to prove a point one way or the other, I mean that's a real slippery slope. But to go back to ivermectin for a second, I did have, and I was going to cover it, I must have missed out somewhere, I did have several instances where I thought that my treating myself was getting somewhere. The major one, which I am totally convinced of, is I have hyperplasia of the prostate, and that resolved from my getting up 8 times a night for a pee to once a night, if that. And that is more than anecdotal. It's completely coincidental to the treatment. And all 3 consultants, when I've mentioned this to them, I saw them making a note, not in my notes, but in their diary to have a look at it. And also I got the impression that clinically I was getting better from time to time, but that was just no more than a clinical hunch. But to go back to something I suppose we've almost been skirting around, there's this guy who really majors on ivermectin, who has been hounded out of the States, out of Canada, both by the government and by the medical authorities as a charlatan, although he is a fully qualified oncologist. And he's now doing some work in Florida in a lab set up by the Florida's governor's wife, who had cancer herself and who believes in just testing some of these repurposed drugs. And he's been given the job to do that. Now he has, I think, thousands, if not millions of followers, particularly on the ivermectin story and the thibenzol story, or using the two together. If you go on his Substack, you'll find masses and masses of anecdotal information coming in. 67-year-old woman with breast cancer, now in remission. 94-year-old chap with prostate, no longer growing or something. I mean, and lots of them. And they can't all be made up. Because I think there is quite a lot of evidence that there must be something in it, they should all be listened to. On the other hand, most of these patients as well would have tried something else first. So again, it's not clean data. It's highly suspect data. But there's so much of it that if they were able to collect it, then I cannot but believe that statisticians might be able to look for a pattern or trend and take into account these confounding aspects of the reports that they're receiving, that someone might be making it up, someone may be sitting down at a desk making story after story. And part of the problem is because the oncologists won't engage. If they engage, say, come on, let's set up a trial. Oh, that's interesting. You've got slightly better, slightly quicker than I'd have thought with your condition. Have you been doing anything differently? You've been eating some obscure Indian herb or something or other. But there's lack of inquiry. What they do is you just take credit for the person getting better and move on. And that, I think, is a huge amount of data which could be partially formalized very easily. But even if it can't, the data cannot be without any merit.
Well,
because you're talking about all the English-speaking peoples for starters, and I think a lot more besides.
yeah, I think that's it. Like you said, that inquiry. I mean, I'll give you a great example. The fire service never did any research whatsoever on the impact of shift work on physical health or mental health. And I, 10 years ago, had to go in all these other branches of the military and the sporting arena and so many other areas to pull this data. And people would say, well, we need to see data in the fire service. I'm like, yeah, so do I. But no one's done it. The first question is, why not? Doesn't mean that it doesn't exist just because someone hasn't done the studies. And this is to your point. Now, is that resistance because more expensive drugs don't want that study done? Is there a political element like we saw in COVID, and all of a sudden you're told that this one thing, is the devil, and this other one, masks are, going to stop your kids from being little murderers for their grandparents, and this horse wormer is the devil, and that wasn't even science. That was a political commentary by that point. So, and then even knowing now that a lot of the medical schools in America are funded by drug companies. You talk about a conflict of interest. I mean, that's awful, because now they're just grooming medics to prescribe. And even with the obesity conversation here, someone told me the other day, oh, we're making a dent on obesity because now we're recommending GLP-1s for everyone.
Yeah.
Well, all you're doing is funding the drug companies and giving them medication that is not improving gut bacteria, is not improving cardiovascular health. I mean, none of this stuff. You're just helping the person starve themselves to death, and then they got to be on it the rest of their life. So that's not a solution. But the drug companies are probably loving it. The $1,000 a hit, whatever it is. So yeah. I mean, I think there is an awakening. It really is, and the trusted voices in the alternative treatments are who we need. The charlatans obviously are going to do damage, but the people that have got a proven history, like Russell Foster, are the people that we need to use as examples. Like, hey, when you listen to innovation, these are the forward steps that we can make. If you demonize it and say everyone doesn't agree with you as a charlatan, I mean, look at acupuncture, look at chiropractic. I mean, we know that there are areas where it's incredibly helpful, but they were demonized for the longest time. So and I think even looking back, to ancient medicine, ancient wisdom, now we're circling around and going, oh, maybe the Stoics were right about some of these things. So yeah, I think there's a lot of value to all the things that you said. I want to just give you space as we round off, because we've been talking for 2 hours now, and I'm sure you're getting worn out. Emotionally, mentally, are there any things that you want to talk about your observations of palliative care and end of life?
Well, I've thought about this a lot, and I don't know if I'm. I get very tearful when I realize what I'm leaving. I've got so much I still want to do, and I'm not going to get to do it. And all the people I'll miss, and I think, well, when I've gone, they'll all be doing this, that, and the other. I should not be part of it, because you get a feeling of that now, because you're stuck in bed, and everyone else is busy around the house, and someone rings or comes, and you're not exactly forgotten, but you're not in on the conversation. So it's that sort of loneliness. And certainly I feel sorry for myself not being able to eat properly. I think if the pain gets worse or unmanageable, then I think my frame of mind will change. But I've had a jolly good innings. Christina keeps saying to me, especially with some of the treatments, how long do you want to live? If you don't do this or you don't do that. And it's quite a sanguine argument. But I mean, the other thing to say too is to go back to Prof. Dalgleish, because he's one of these men that I've had 2 or 3 in my career. Russell's another one. You meet them and they're on the right track. You just know intuitively they're on the right track. And the American Senate invited him over, or at least some Americans invited him to speak to the American Senate Health Committee. And I hope he gets somewhere. I actually think things are just beginning to move. But I cannot believe that it isn't in the government's interest to throw some money. You're talking about tiny amounts of money for his vaccine alone. Well, and if any of these repurposing drugs, you see, the other thing to be said that I didn't say is these repurposing drugs, a lot of them have been found to be useful as an adjunct to chemotherapy. Because Prof, perhaps it's a mistake I made. The Prof was quite anxious that I went on one of the chemo, and went on the other things as well, like the wormers and vitamin D and low dose naltrexone, because his argument was you then need a much lower dose of chemo, and if you need a lower dose of chemo, you get many fewer side effects, and those effects you do get are less severe. And so that in itself is worth doing. And that's adding it into the treatment, not solely treating it. No one at the moment is solely treated, except this Canadian guy who's now in America, have claimed serious results with just those two drugs. And even his cases, I bet some of them had primary surgery or had chemo or had radiotherapy, and it's not worked. Well, that confounds some of your data too.
Is there anything you want to say before we close out?
Well, only that try and, if you've got a duodenal tumor or a tumor where you'd like to have a stent, try and get someone on side with you who's a GP, so you've got a way in. I'm talking about the English system, British system. You've got a way in to you, because you'll feel much better if you feel you're doing absolutely everything you could. You feel much better. And what I've done is every time I've had two complications. One was a gut bleed from the tumor, and the other was pulmonary embolism. Now, the moment those occurred, I backed off my veterinary treatment for several weeks. And if I'd had them really on side, I needn't have done that. And I feel that left a hiatus. And as much that if my treatment was going to work, it's now going to have to work in spite of that. Whereas I could have not complained about anything if I'd been on it in parallel while they were doing everything else. But this I do understand, because they don't know the interaction, of course, of a lot of things. But they have all been worked through in the lab. For instance, we knew that low-dose naproxen interferes with warfarin. So, it's not as if we don't know these things. It's just that because it hasn't transposed from monkey to man, that no one's interested. And and also in the back of my mind, I think there is some corruption. I think there's some intellectual corruption. And I think there's some laziness, that people are not on top of their jobs to make these decisions for the good of the country. They're almost being promoted beyond their capability. And that goes to the top scientists, as far as I'm concerned, is because one of the reasons why I came to respect Prof. Dalgleish so much was I knew his name in connection with rubbishing statistical modeling of disease. He disagreed big time with my college, Imperial College Mathematics Department, who have modeled or got a name for modeling diseases, things like BSE, COVID, foot and mouth, several of them. And I thought, well, yes, I agree with him. And his explanation is, and I think it's very valid, is that these mathematical modelers rely on numbers entirely, and they don't have any clinicians' input whatsoever. And I think if you could find a clinician who's a good mathematician, you'd be a long way to getting a better model. The prediction of deaths from BSE was in the tens of thousands, and I think it was under 500 or something. It was tiny, and that really depresses me. And again, it emphasizes his clarity of thinking. He's really worth. I mean, I'd love to be able to debate things with him, as I say, without paying the fee per hour.
Well, we've been talking for over 2 hours. I know we've hit everything that we had wanted to talk about today. So
yeah.
I just want to say thank you. I mean, we got to sit down for another 2 hours. We got to, as you said, leave the wisdom, the lessons that you learned from your journey, and hopefully people listening, whether they're in the medical field, whether they're a patient, that people will get something from this conversation, and hopefully that will lead them to a more proactive path that will help them avoid some of the issues that you've had to go through.
The other thing, just to finish off, is that try and find out where the drugs you're being given are absorbed. Paracetamol, which majors for me, is absorbed in the small intestine, but also a little bit in the stomach, and therefore you can be aware of how you should be taking things and when for the greatest efficacy. CPD, for instance, you try and leave it on the mucous membrane for as long as possible. Oh, the other thing also I would think about is quite a few of these antiemetic tablets, you can have a little wafer you put under your tongue. Little things like that make the difference to your life, as opposed to having to wait for the tablet to go down and get absorbed 3/4 of an hour later.
All right. Well, I know that we were about to wrap up the conversation, but there was a couple of things that you realized that you hadn't covered yet. So let's start with liquid biopsy.
Yeah, well, basically, because they couldn't get a satisfactory solid biopsy, the consultant suggested to me that there's a new technique called a liquid biopsy, which I have to pay for myself, which is a blood sample taken and sent to America. Costs about 3,000 quid. And it basically looks for any particle or break off protein from the tumor. And from that, they can then type the tumor in the same way as they hope to be able to type it from a solid biopsy sample. This came back, and I forget the exact, I think it was a G12D form of adenocarcinoma, for which there is a monoclonal antibody treatment, I think made by Pfizer. I'm not sure about that. But unfortunately, the thing is to then try and get on a trial, and I'm too old and don't qualify for the trial. At the same time, I came across a cytokine, which is I think related to a growth hormone, which in cancer patients is hugely raised and causes cachexia and loss of appetite and nausea in cancer patients. And there is a treatment for that too, which, because if you take samples from a normal individual, let's say they have a unit of 1 in their blood. People with advanced cancer will have 13 units of this particular cytokine, which I think is related to a growth hormone. Anyway, the treatment for that is also efficacious and is also in the final throes of trial. But again, I don't qualify for that. So I think the next generation coming along, you should have a look at those two things, because I think you may find that they are available to you and are specific treatment.
With the liquid biopsy, we talked obviously about them being unable to get a good biopsy through endoscopy. That's now able to circumnavigate any mechanical biopsy and take it through the blood test. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. But there is one, and I can't remember what it is. There is one particular set of markers that they cannot pick up by blood. I can't remember what it is, but it covers almost everything bar one. So it's well worth, if you can afford it, it's well worth doing. And I suppose in due course it'll be available on the National Health Service anyway.
Talk to me about the sarcopenia, the muscle wastage from especially a GI related cancer like this. How are you able to try and maintain the muscle mass and not allow the wastage to happen too quickly?
Well, it's really, really hard because you just don't feel like eating. Quite often you're not sick if you do eat, but you just don't feel like it and you can't face it. And for a second you think, I really fancy so-and-so, and then when it comes along, you don't. And part of it's related to texture too, because you can't have it. If you've got a duodenal stent, you can't have anything with any texture to it because it bungs up the stent. So you've basically been cut off from good nutrients, good absorption, and it's very, very difficult to stop yourself losing muscle. Ironically, I think I'm putting on fat because most of the stuff that comes my way is very, very sweet.
We talked obviously before about juicing. There are, protein shakes or some other things. What have you found that has helped at least try and give you some nutrition during this?
Well, all those things really, protein shakes and the advice you gave me of certain protein additives. But it hasn't made much difference. I think, because I went into it too late, but I still have nausea. I've had it today with a protein shot. In fact, I'm feeling really, really nauseous now. And it's all to do, I think, with the fact I've had slightly more opioids today and I've had the protein shake.
What about exercise levels? What were you able to do early in the diagnosis, and what has been the decline in your ability? Because obviously that's a big part of maintaining, bone density, muscle mass, etc.
Yeah. Well, I was able to do a lot of that early on, right until I refused Whipple. And from then onwards, both the progress of the clinical disease and everything else, I've just got less and less impetus to exercise, very difficult to exercise. And I would urge anyone to just do as much as they possibly can, but I have definitely not done enough.
Now, I know the other thing you want to talk about was drug trials.
Yeah, well, I've really covered that. It's, I think one must be open-minded about a drug trial if you're offered it. But at my age, you're not going to be offered it. Apart from anything else, they don't want too many old codgers confounding the data. So I think by all means try. And the only thing I could do is to go back and have another look at histotripsy to see if they can treat my secondaries. And if they can treat my secondaries, do I get an abscopal effect on my main tumor? That's open to debate because abscopal effects on their own are fairly rare. And I can imagine it almost impossible to shrug off the initial tumor without having had surgery or radiotherapy or some such intervention.
I had a guest on who had ALS, and he was part of a drug trial, and they were seeing not so much improvement, but a rapid slowing of the progression of the disease. And when they came to the end of the drug trial, they were taken off, and that was it. And when you've got, ALS, obviously he wasn't anywhere near as close to end of life, but if you've got someone who is, older and has a terminal cancer diagnosis, you would think that there would be an opportunity to be more lenient on, the use of these. If it's, something that is not going to end well anyway, what have you really got to lose by allowing some people to continue to take something that you've started to show was effective in a trial? What is your philosophy on that?
Well, it seems nonsensical. In fact, I gather, I'm not sure if I'm right. You can tell me if that's the case, but I gather Mr. Trump gave people back the right to try in these sort of situations, to try stuff that's fringe or off-piste. And I think it's immoral not to do that. In fact, I think it's against the Hippocratic Oath. If you know there's something that can help you, it should be made available to you. Not necessarily on the National Health Service, of course, but there should be some way to protect the doctor from sticking his neck out and protect you from sticking your neck out. Well, I did say earlier on that the one thing that there are a couple of things really that don't sink in when you're told at the first instance of terminal diagnoses. One is that you'll never feel as well as you do on this particular day, the day the nurse is telling you this. I did mention that earlier on. And the other is the fact that cancer just takes over virtually your whole metabolism. You seem to get completely reprogrammed. Your senses change and the way your body functions change. Your taste of smell changes. This may not be true of everyone, but in my case, it's particularly acute. I can think of something I really want to eat, and then I come to taste it, and it's like eating cardboard. Secondly, a really interesting phenomena, and I don't know how to pronounce this. I think it's called phantom nausea, but it sounds like a made-up name. But you get the smell, an imagined smell. You think you can smell fish and chips. You think you can smell some nasty smells. You think you can smell bacon and eggs, and there's no source of those aromas at all. And then the other thing too that I find really strange is the way that the pain manifests itself. It moves, for me, it moves across my stomach where the tumor is, and into my back, either side of my back, into my shoulders, and that's quite, it's not so much disconcerting, but it's difficult to understand the rationale of why the pain behaves like that. In fact, for me, the pain in the morning tends to be across the abdomen, and from lunchtime onwards, it's mostly in the back. That's really what I wanted to add.
What is your hypothesis on that? Because you would think if there's a tumor and it was applying pressure or occluding blood vessels or whatever it was doing, that the pain wouldn't be intermittent, it would be consistent.
I know, it's really, really, really strange. It is completely inconsistent. I haven't had one recently, but sometimes I can have 2 or 3 day runs of no pain at all. I still have got no appetite, which is cancer cachexia, but and that's a well-known, well-documented condition with most cancers, I think. But I think it does depend. I think, first of all, you can get phantom pain, and secondly, I think it does depend on where the tumors themselves are impinging on nerve supplies. When I was last talking to one of the nurses about this, she was saying there's quite a lot of nerves in the area of the tumor, which I find slightly strange. I'd expect them all to be related to alimentary function. But I suppose you wouldn't expect many nerves doing other things to be in the area of the where the tumor is stuck to the liver. That seems odd to me. But anyway, it happens, and it happens in many people, I think. The other thing I learnt this morning, I went to the dentist because I've had really stabbing pain in one tooth, excruciating pain. Unfortunately, each episode is short-lived. And I was really shocked because I was up to my eyes in various forms of morphine. And I couldn't understand why I was still feeling this pain. But the dentist said dental pain is one of the pain sensors that can circumnavigate morphine, or morphine cannot control a dental pain. In fact, I'm going to look it up in a minute and see if there's a rationale for that.
That's really interesting, because the only time I've ever been prescribed opioids in my life was firstly for dental surgery. I think it was a root canal that I had done. So, the other one with my knee surgeries. But I heard several people say that was the beginning of, for example, an opioid addiction was prescription of opioids after some sort of oral surgery.
Yeah, I'm surprised. I mean, presumably, did you have paracetamol and codeine?
They don't have codeine here. Yeah, you can't have codeine. It's weird. You know, if I have to go to the
Oh,
UK,
right. Okay.
because I can buy codeine over the counter in England, can't I?
Yeah, you can. Yeah.
Yeah, it's treated
In small
like some,
quantities, you
you
can.
know, horrendous drug over here, but then your physician will prescribe
Yeah.
you oxycodone like sweets. So it's just very weird.
Yeah. Yeah. But you can imagine that a dentist might give you paracetamol with codeine, because paracetamol would be quite good on its own. Not that good. I mean, root canal, they're threatening to do a root canal on me for this problem. What I've got is old damage, old repair, a sort of a small version of a root canal has obviously been done historically to me. I don't remember it. And some infection has got behind it. And I think what's happening is it builds up and I get this acute pain for a very short time. It's only minutes at a time. And then it subsides. And I think what must happen is the pus must leak out of the sinus. And the moment the pressure is off, the pain is off.
Mm-hmm.
And the way they're treating it, I mean, it again comes to, you don't think about it going to the dentist under normal circumstances. Once you're a cancer patient, everything is different. And so I asked them, can I please avoid extraction because I'm on a blood thinner, and can they treat it some other way? I thought they would be drilling it out and packing it with a sort of treatment package, which is what I had before. They drill it out and treat it with a filling that deals with the pain at a local level. But this particular dentist said, no, we're going to put you on antibiotics. And I'm really very optimistic that you will get a long period of remission with straightforward antibiotics if we can just get it sorted well enough. You could go several months and even a year before something happens again.
Well, I don't think we talked about this before, but while we're on the subject, you had pulmonary embolism, so obviously you needed to have blood thinners. But that then adds another level of danger when it comes to any sort of surgery, when it comes to a fall. So talk to me about that, the kind of seesaw of blood thinners and other treatments. And also there's the cardiac issue too. You don't want to be throwing clots from that either. But then, I think you were saying there's a danger of even the tumor being able to bleed because of the blood thinner. So you've got this kind of tug of war thing going on.
Yeah, you've got basically. I mean, they've skilled the way that my treatment plan is fairly skilled, because, as you say, you've got the tumor with the potential to bleed, which is going to bleed anyway. Sooner or later, it'll outgrow its blood supply and get necrosis and perhaps necrosis of a blood vessel. But obviously, with a blood thinner, it's that much more likely. So what they've done, in my case, they've taken me off a very good blood thinner, which I was on for the pulmonary embolism, and put me on a lesser thinner. They could have put me on a smaller dose, I suppose, but they put me on a lesser thinner, which is heparin. And I think because the half-life of heparin is a lot less than the half-life of bexapan, I think it's called, it gives them more safety margin if you do start bleeding. The other trade-off you have is constipation and laxative. That's a function, again, of morphine, but that's one of the most difficult trade-offs. And even more difficult is trying to get food into yourself so you're not starving yourself, because the nausea and the lack of appetite and lack of taste all contribute to complicating your treatment. Therefore, all your nutrients are down. Add to this that you've got a stent, and you cannot have solid food. You've got to have liquid food. Absorption is not so good anyway because of pancreatic malfunction, and that's of course negated to a great extent by, in my case, a trade name called Creon, CREON, which is basically pig enzymes, pig pancreatic enzymes. And I can remember as a student stripping out pancreases from pig carcasses as they went through the line to be sent off to harvest the pig enzymes for conditions such as mine. Fortunately, the insulin side of things is not affected at the moment. It's purely the digestive side. And of course, that results either with malabsorption because of the mechanical presence of the stent and or lack of proper balance between food and crayon. And also you tend to forget it. I mean, I've been on it a long time now, and I can forget to take my tablets, which is really irritating. Because then you know you haven't got the nutrients you've just eaten, because they won't be able to deal with it. So I think it's a really good thing to make a podcast on, because this draws together, I suspect, a lot of the complications of a lot of other cancers, but highlights it, I suspect, in people who've got esophageal cancer and duodenal cancer. And I suppose to some extent pancreatic cancer as well.
Is there anything else you want to add?
No, except to reinforce that there is this terrific drug, I think, that Pfizer's got, which I can't have because it's not released yet, which counteracts the excessive. You might find, Jamie, we can put this in later, but it's a cytokine which in the normal individual is at a very low level, but in cancer individuals is at a very high level, and that's why we feel so sick, because it actually interacts with that area of the brain that controls appetite and nausea. And there's a monoclonal antibody that Pfizer have made, which I think has been proved extremely successful in trials. And ironically, of course, the other place where you get a phenomena like this is of course, morning sickness. And I believe they find similarly high levels of this cytokine in the particularly severe form of morning sickness. I forget what it's called, something gravarium, I think. But it was the hijacking of the tumor that I found not difficult to come to terms with, but the penny all the way along I hate this word journey, but all of the journey, it's taken quite a long time for things to sink in. The anatomical things I understand completely, but all the nuanced things I find difficult to take on board. And the longer you have it, the more you realize how important the nuances are.